Hello, good day everyone, and welcome. It's a pleasure to see you. Pleasure to welcome you in Diona for the third installment of our talk series, Sessions of Territory, Urbanism Beyond Neoliberalism. And we have a great pleasure to welcome Raquel Polnik. Our talk series is realized collaboratively, as most of you know, collaboration between two chairs, Professorship Marc Angélil and my team, Architecture of Territory, supported by Sasha Deltz and Ferdinand Pappenheim. And this is a very specific format. We have 5 talks in every semester, in every talk series. And the talk is followed by a debate, and we treat the debate, let's say, perhaps on the same level as the talk. We try to really curate these sessions in order to, let's say, advance our understanding of this topic. So let me say a few words once again about the choice of the theme and why we decided to concentrate. As a matter of fact, over the period of 2 years, we'll be running this talk series over the period of 2 years, and why we choose to tackle neoliberalism and urbanism beyond neoliberalism. So, of course, it is a broad term and also criticized by some authors in the sense that it's too complex and it doesn't perhaps capture clearly all the complexity of our world. But basically, it describes, in a broad sense, mainstream form of politics and also form of ideology that has dominated large parts of the world since the 70s and the 80s. And it is described as a withdrawal of state institutions from decision-making in urban space in the widest variety of ways, in the favor of what is understood or called market forces, such as the laissez-faire, the hands-off approach. And the historian William Davis recently described neoliberalism as disenchantment of politics by economics. And neoliberal position argues that, left to its own devices, market will tend to produce more innovative, more efficient results compared to the regular social democratic decision-making processes that used to be tied to state institutions. So what interests us especially here, and there it is fantastic, and I think Raquel will be able to help us, is how has neoliberalism affected the role of architects, urbanists, urban planners, how it has shaped the urban built space, and what should happen next. If we look back long enough, in Europe, for example, we see that the architect of the 70s and the 80s was mainly a civil servant with the task to contribute to the society and to the public good. But today, the architect is positioned completely differently, without perhaps a clear social and public role, and much more reliant on the private agency than before. So in other words, we might say that as a consequence of the neoliberal transformation, the architect has lost his mandate from the state, and his influence in shaping urban built space has greatly diminished. And with that, urbanism as a discipline has been weakened too. So it is more important, it is extremely important, perhaps more important than ever, to imagine how our practice can respond to these conditions and how it can change, how it can transform, what should be urbanism in the future. And in that sense, we have proposed the word project, the notion of the project, as the leading theme, as the umbrella theme of this talk series. So what should be the urban project that we can still envision under these conditions? And this is why I believe that Raquel Rolnik is really a person that perhaps more than other speakers we have had, will be able to help us in this sense. Let me tell you about Raquel. Because of her background, she has had a variety of experiences that make her experiences extremely valuable to our discussion. So I will read her impressive CV. Raquel Rolnik is a professor, architect, and urban planner with over 35 years of scholarship, activism, and practical experience in planning, urban land policy, and housing issues. Based in Sao Paulo, she is a professor at the Faculty of Architecture and Urbanism of the University of Sao Paulo. In her career, she has held various government positions, including Director of the Planning Department of the City of Sao Paulo from 1989 to 92, and National Secretary for Urban Programs of the Brazilian Ministry of Cities from 2003 to 2007, as well as NGO activities such as Urban Policy Coordinator of the Policy Institute 97 to 2002. From May 2008, Ms. Raquel Rolnik was appointed by the UN Human Rights Council as UN Special Rapporteur on Adequate Housing for a 6-year mandate ending June 2014. She is the author of several books, including Urban Warfare, Housing and Cities in the Age of Finance, to be published this year, and The City and the Law, among others. And it will be a pleasure to hear Raquel's experiences in this kind of extraordinarily wide career that is tied to government and governing institutions, including the UN, in the lecture called Landscapes for Profit, Landscapes for Life. And let me also mention that our respondent, Arno Brandelhuber, to whom we can thank for bringing us in contact with Raquel, couldn't come today. However, we will have a pleasure to talk to Raquel in an extended team, including Charlotte Malterre Barthes and Ferdinand Pappenheim and Sasha Delz. So please welcome Raquel Rolnik.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I would like to thank you very much for the invitation. I would like to thank Marc, Angélil, also Milica and Sasha for making possible this opportunity to share with you some thoughts with this session. So basically, I was provoked here to provide a rather international rather than a Brazilian picture of the topic. But of course, during the discussion, I might go deeper into the Brazilian or Latin American specificity, because you're going to see we're going to talk about a global process, completely planetary process, which is the same everywhere, but it's unique everywhere, according to the political economy of urban and housing in each place. So, what very strange new landscapes, despite affirming uniqueness and singularities in their spectacular and unique forms, repeat themselves over and over again across the globe, taking over territories in such different cities: Chicago, Dubai, Astana, Kazakhstan, Belgrade, Rio. So we are talking about international hotels, shopping malls, livable sidewalks, corporate towers. So what do they have in common? Because they are identical everywhere, despite being in the middle of the desert or in a very remote place of Central Asia. They are products, real estate products, real estate financial complex products. And their architecture and their morphology is exactly meant to be there, to be understandable by the sort of financial capital which is embedded in it and producing it and reproducing. So this kind of products, yes, and I'm talking about the Western new development of Zürich as well, of course, they are the ones that are capable to attract the wall of money. What is the wall of money? This electronic cloud of financial fluxes which are hanging over the planet, and we are talking about surplus capital which is invested in the financial, including pension funds of the workers, including the wealth of plutocrats, Russian plutocrats, including the sovereign fund of countries and national banks, including our own poor savings, circulating over the planet, and it's a huge amount of money. Can you believe, like just Apple, the ones that provides iPhones, smartphones, Apple investment fund is larger than the Germany sovereign fund in terms of amount of money which is being circulating over the planet, and which are a type of money seeking desperately where to lend in order to have more interest, to have more profit, to be bigger, to seek where to invest in order to have more money, in order to be bigger, to seek where to invest. And I can be like for half an hour repeating this because there is nothing to do with production. I would say, again, taking the example of Apple, maybe 1% of Apple's surplus is invested in innovation and production of new apparatus, of new things, producing new materials. 99% is just circulating and looking for more money and a rent-seeking financial capital in its hunger of assets. And real estate, and especially built space, became a fundamental part of this financial circuit, a special part of this financial circle. Why? Several reasons. One of the principal, is that real estate, built space, in its very perennial outlook, can provide a long-run expectation of remuneration of capital. Even if today is a downtown crisis, but then in 10 years from now or in 15 years from now, this can be retaken. So the time span of the built space is very important. Also, built space and space territories in general, land in territory, is a very powerful collateral, which means that investment funds, if they have land or real estate or built space in their profile, they can raise more money. They can access more money, providing that land or that built space as a guarantee. So we know that typically when we take a mortgage and the property of the place is the guarantee for the bank that you're going to pay back. So that's how it works. So we are talking about a global, new colonial empire without flag nor face, global finance that is including more and more circulating outside the jurisdictions of the countries themselves. So I'm talking about tax-free heaven paradises where even those financial capital don't pay any tax to the states. So they are increasingly circulating through these non-deterritorialized spaces. So we are talking about a deterritorialized, a fiction, a abstract, a speculative nature of capital, because this is the nature of financial capital. Financial capital is speculative by nature. It's not a deviation of the nature of this capital. It's betting on possible gains, future gains. So this type of capital is taking over the cities and building those landscapes, rent-seeking landscapes, landscapes for profit. So it's a movement that it's everywhere, and of course it's specific in different places. It's not new that financial capital fixes in cities and transforms cities. Of course, we have a historical process on that, and David Harvey's notion of spatial fix, I think it's a very useful notion in order to understand that. Fix in the terms of to fix a crisis of surplus of capital. There is a surplus of capital. So in order to fix this crisis, you create a new frontier of investment. Typically, all the railroad constructions in the world are like that. Or you expand frontiers for the capital to get more markets, geographical expansion. Or you export people when you have a surplus of labor towards other countries, and this is part of the history of migration, international migration in the world. So, I mean, this is not new. We have seen that many, many times. But now there is a difference now. And what is the difference? Of course, there is a difference of scale, because the amount of capital, and since neoliberal policies that had removed any barrier of this financial capital to circulate, because it's forbidden for any country to put any barrier, and if the president don't obey, you just impeach her, like what happened in Brazil with Dilma Rousseff. One of the reasons, not the reason, but one of the reasons why she was impeached, because she dared to establish a maximum rate of interest for the international capital, one of the reasons. So just get rid of her. But the thing is that there is a scales, because you have a huge amount. Can you imagine? Chinese oil sheikhs, sovereign funds. So you have a huge amount of capital circulating. But more important than that, we, through technology and through the design and the enforcement and implementation of new financial instruments, we could finally overcome the barrier of fixity of architecture. Because what is the problem with architecture? This very tectonic art, which is in place, is that there was a limit for architecture to circulate as a commodity or as a financial asset. And the limit was the fact that there was a limit to architecture to move. It was impossible to move from one place to the other. So this barrier was overcome by the process that we call titularization. What is titularization? We have new instruments like real estate investment funds, securitization and other instruments that make possible for the financial capital to be related to a place without being embedded or fixed in this place. So it's a piece of paper that provides you the interest and the rent that can come from that investment without being really the property owner of some particular part of it. So this is what is titularization. And titularization avoids transaction cost, notary cost, languages barriers, because you can have a stake. So typically shopping malls are like that. You can have a stake and a part of it, a quota of the investment, and you can pass the quota to other people, to other people, to other people very easily without moving the entire property. So this was one of the barriers that were overcome and made possible to this colonial empire to just take over the planet, period. So but here, what I want to develop, it's more than discussing this type of architecture, is to argue about the relationship with the territories that are not taken over or occupied by this logic. So I am talking about the landscapes for life. I am talking about the type of living space, which of course there are market forces, there are market and money circulating, nothing is outside that, but that are organized under different logics and are not completely taken over by this logic. And the intrinsic process, and this is also part of spatial fix, the destructive nature of built space, because we are talking about constructing new places, but we are talking about destroying and denying some places. Typically, like industrial activities in the last decades of 20th century and all the space that they had, a very important space in the cities, and the whole political economy of destroying industrialization and industries open up this new ground or new frontier for the real estate financial complex, typically. But also, and that's what I want to talk a little bit here, we are talking about operations of dispossession. Operations of dispossession means the destruction of the life, the culture, the values, but the taking over of the land occupied by those landscapes for life, marked by the logic of survival, of the desires of prosperity of those who live there. So we are talking about favelas, bastis, kampungs, slums, but we are also talking about immigrants and refugee neighborhoods. So we are talking clearly, when we are talking about this the other part of the city, we are talking about racial, ethnic signs, sometimes religious as well, when they are completely mixed. So they basically have in common, what do they have in common? They basically have in common life being lived under scarce resources. But the whole operation, and the whole operation that will justify the destruction of this type of landscapes, is to identify life being lived under scarce resources with outcast, subnormal, as the Brazilian census calls the favela dwellers subnormal agglomerates. So clearly tracing a border of rights and non-rights, legal, illegal, in a very discriminatory gestalt, in which architecture and urban planning has a central role on establishing these borders, which means what is in order, what is outside of the border. So urban law regulations clearly are the ones that draws the borderline between those. Of course, we can locate at the end of 19th century the origin and the starting point of a discipline, this discipline of planning, in which public or common spaces were converted into private property of state, the idea of private property of the government, the ones that Milica in the introduction was referring to, building a notion of a public absolutely identified with the state or with the government, which was absolutely fundamental to implement its governmentability tactics. So planning provided the territorial administration of cities under the signs of order, of discipline, of rationality, and of course, planning provided more velocity for capital circulation, but at the same time, through zoning, for instance, because planning became, and urban design became basically zoning, established a very tight and perverse relationship between real estate products and morphologies forbidden or allowed in certain places of the city. But also, planning in the beginning of last century was a part of an avant-garde movement politically based on a territorial pact in which workers and the working class should have a very important place that provided, for instance, the allocation of urban land to social housing, to cooperatives, to municipal housing, and all sorts of housing policies as a very important part of the welfare state. So we are talking about a political, cultural ideal of justice, of universality of rights, of equality, and the whole operation was that the surplus of capital managed by the state should build social homes, social housing, and social equipment, and providing the basic conditions for the reproduction of the workforce. So we are talking about a utopian reform theory of the state that created and really created and generated a very important part of our spaces in our cities. But it was, in a way, a territorial reconfiguration laboratory. And you can imagine how much this also has been a colonial imposition over the territories and the way territories were organized outside the center of capitalism, I would say, in the periphery of capitalism, setting also what should be the utopia. The utopia should be the utopia of Western welfare state, including its form and its architecture and its planning rules. So you have here also a very colonialist imposition of a political culture that came from one territory and was imposed over other territories. So creating space that are clearly politically and culturally identified with the occupation force of those territories, of those colonial territories. But what happened in the 70s, so I just jump the whole history, and I won't expand the whole idea of the role of planning in colonization and occupation cities. I think it's a very important debate. But I would say that the whole picture has changed a lot, starting again in US, UK, in the center of capitalism, and spreading over the planet again. And the contemporary financial capitalism, you could name it neoliberal. I think it's a useful framework. It has a lot of things inside it. But it's basically that together with the destruction of actual industrial places and the destruction of what could be a working class, we also had the imaginary destruction of workers and workers' pride as if it was during the welfare state. So basically with the breaking of Bretton Woods Pact and that opened up the possibilities of rising interest rates of bank and financial products, and that created what we call the fiscal deficit of the states. So all of a sudden, states don't have money anymore. I'm sorry, they are indebted, they cannot pay for the welfare state, they cannot provide service, the money just disappears, and they have very huge debts, and they need to restructure the debt, and in order to restructure the debt, they need to dismantle the welfare state, and of course, that depended a lot on how much that happened in one setting or other, more or less, more radical or less radical dismantling of the welfare state. And part of it, a very important part of it, was the dismantling of housing policies, including the physical demolition of the complexes, the housing project that happened in different places. Massive privatization of social housing in countries like UK, or the physical destruction of housing projects like it happened in the US. And that was very much intensified after the fall of Berlin Wall, in a way that almost all the barriers that still existed, like communist states, were just disappear, and that became the order everywhere. But it's very important to say that the machinery that made possible, the imaginary and cultural machinery that made possible for states, because we are talking about a state-led process. I mean, if somebody said, oh no, let states get rid of it, the market will provide. No, no, no. Neoliberal is 100% state-led. Is the state that deregulate, that create new regulations, that attract, that mobilizes capital, that invented new public-private partnerships and things like that, is state-led and state reform. So everywhere we had, it was very important also in order to destroy the welfare state and to destroy the redistribution of wealth through the welfare state, to create a new ideology, which is the market will provide housing for all, and that will be very easily done through home ownership and credit, bank credit, in a way that the debt, state debt, was passed to family debt. So basically, the families were the ones that, from that point on, would take the money and will have the debt. But again, in order to be possible to do that, the ideal of home ownership should be a very strong ideal. So the idea of living in a housing project in several cities became a synonym of being marginal, loser, outcast, or immigrant, or anything that is related to a second-class citizen. And the ideal is basically the idea of home ownership. So in this graphic, you have, and again, with state money and public funds, the blue line shows how much money the national US budget put into social housing over time, with the money that US national policy put on subsidizing home ownership through tax exemptions. So it's not a question of not using state money or public fund to housing. No. It's using a large amount of public money, but instead of putting that into social housing, into rental housing for low income, putting that on subsidies for home ownership for the middle class, and also using the idea that the suburban home or the home owner is the one that should be the model for all. And then we had everywhere changes in housing policies, which is very important, that the changes in housing policies and housing financial products that were done over the planet, they, in a way, they had to destroy all the other alternatives in order to push everybody into mortgage, into credit. So the destruction of the welfare state and housing policies was a very important part of the whole process of promoting a new housing policy based on home ownership and credit. And so because of that, and this was adopted by the countries themselves, but also heavily marketized by international cooperation, the World Bank, and also international donors supplying the technical means for housing reform everywhere, with different forms. We say, like in UK with more privatization and private home ownership, in US and Spain, subprime credits pushing towards low-income people. In Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, more based on the Chilean model, which is the neoliberal laboratory of Latin America, in which the state subsidizes, the state gives money to the people to buy the products, the homes produced by the private market in the peripheries, basically. So there are different models, but of the same policy. And basically, what happened, and I have here a series, just a series of slides showing that what emerges, and that, of course, the first sign of the failure of this promise that the market will provide housing for all was the financial crisis and the mortgage crisis. So all of a sudden, in countries like the US, you have a housing crisis, a foreclosure crisis. In Kazakhstan, when I was there, there was a hunger strike on housing because people put money to buy houses, and then the Turkish construction companies just went out without delivering the houses. But also, the whole organization, Plataforma de los Afectados por las Hipotecas in Spain, with the ones that were deceased and they lost their houses, the protests in Israel, in Tel Aviv, the cuts in the welfare system in United Kingdom, empty houses in Mexico, and in the type of housing in this orderly, market-oriented neighborhood, which is beautiful, like you can see here, completely empty, ghost cities in China, overbuilt, so global housing crisis, including in countries that didn't have a housing crisis, like since the post-World War II, like UK. And they are living through a housing crisis now. But what I want to show up is the relationship between financialization of housing, because the taken over of the housing sector by the financial sector. This was what really happened. And when the financial sector decided that it was not more profitable to be in the housing sector, they just fled. You say in Spanish, in Mexico, capital golondrina, which is a capital. What is the name of this bird that migrates? Swallow? That migrates very, very large places. That's exactly what happened. Capital just said, oh, no, it's not profitable anymore. I go out. And then just bankrupt the whole sector. And there is this very small detail that provoked a huge number of homeless in places. We have, in one single night, 550,000 homeless in the US. It's a record. It's more than in the crisis of 1929. So what is the relationship, just to finish here, of the landscapes that I showed with the ones of housing? Because besides being housing a new frontier of financialization, and that's why the housing projects of the program Minha Casa, Minha Vida, My House, My Life in Brazil are not very pretty, not very interesting in terms of urban or architecture. It has nothing to do with lack of creativity of Brazilian architects. It has much more to do with the financial logic behind. Because the only way you can make money as being a private entrepreneur, the only way you can make money within the program is if you launch a huge scale, if you work in a huge scale, and you don't pay anything for the land. So the condition is to implement the housing project completely outside of the cities, in the rural areas, in the middle of nowhere. So this is structural. Has nothing to do with creativity of imagination of the architects. So we are talking about forms. We are talking about the political economy of form. And we are talking about how much the profession has completely being under this logic. And the relationship between this logic with the first series of slides on the landscapes for rent-seeking landscapes is the mantra of urban policies that we have now, which is unlock land value. So how much such a very well-located place in the city can host this very non-profitable way of using the city, like low-income housing or very small shops, traditional shops. So let's unlock the value. And unlock the value means necessarily massive process of dispossession and dislocation. So again, this is structural. It's not contingent. So it's not by chance that all the developments that promise affordable housing and we're going to have also place for everybody, it's a lie. It's a lie because the logic behind public-private partnership pushes towards exclusionary places that including can be empty for decades. Because for an investment, a big investment fund, to have this empty for 10 years is no problem. But for the city and for the people who are badly in need of housing and public spaces, it is a big, big problem. So what I'm talking about is that this new house, the other side of these housing policies is it's also became a eviction tool. So a new mechanisms that provide the means to evict people from, not from everywhere, from very well located place. So if you see the map of evictions of social housing demolition in the US, or from informal settlement eviction in Rio, it's not everywhere. It's just in the very well located spot where the real estate financial complex is taking over. But this whole process, and I will finish with that before everybody wants to just go away and kill itself, because what can we do? So please don't do that. This process does not happen without resistance and without struggles everywhere. So we have seen scenes from different parts of the world, both from, and I insist that we are talking about the same process. We are not talking about cities of the South, cities of the North. No, it's the same process. They are very different because they are rooted in different histories, but the process is the same. So the neighborhoods that are organizing today in Barcelona against the race of the rental prices, because of course, financial capital now invented a new frontier, which is not home ownership anymore, is rental housing, through global corporate landlords and other mechanisms. And so middle-class neighborhoods are suffering from the rise in rental prices, being pushed out, and organizing unions of tenants in order to face that. And in Brazil, you see, and in many, many other places, informal settlements organized in order to evict and avoid eviction, squatter of land, creating new landscapes of resistance and new landscapes of hope. And a very important part and a very common trend on those right to the city movements, and I see right to the city as a general, it's like neoliberalism, a general platform that you can put a lot of things in, and then you can unpack in every particular setting. Those right to the city movements, part of their strategy has been occupations. Occupy public spaces, private spaces, on a long run or a temporary run, which means these occupations of public and private space, they have a double dimension. At the same time, they have the dimension of confrontation, of saying no, here, no. But at the same time, they also they are saying, no, we are defending, and this part of the territory will not be taken over by the real estate financial complex. It will be ours. So this is a very important part. And this is why the struggles today are mostly urban and are mostly over the territory. But also they have a different dimension, which are the occupations, and especially long-run squatter occupations. They are a prefiguration of alternative ways of organizing collective life. So now, not only as a tactic to demand from the state, but also as construction of counter spaces, contested spaces, prototyping possible futures, process of commoning some places in the opposite directions of privatizing spaces. So what architecture and planning have to do with that? A lot. And I see that conflictual, abolitionist, insurgent planning and architecture are emerging as a practice and as a theory. So those are fluid practices that are based on participation, self-management, survival, and survival practices. But what do we need now? We need those practices, they require nurturing. It's like a baby. You have to nurture. You have to pay attention. They need to create their own cultural landscapes. And for that, I think it's very important to decolonize planning imagination, to get away with the idea of modernization, and to really pay attention on the possibilities of alternative organization of space and territories. Thank you.
So I would like to invite to the podium also Charlotte Malterre Barthes, who is part of Professorship Angélil, and she runs Master of Advanced Studies in Urban Design. One of the most interesting programs in this building, and Charlotte is completing currently her PhD on food systems, food territories, political economy of food systems, and the case is Egypt. Very important study and almost ready, or it's probably already finished. And I also welcome Sasha Deltz, who is, of course, a co-organizer of the lecture series, and he finished also important work, which is called Development Corporation at All Costs, also a kind of, I would say, variant of neoliberal practices in Africa, in Addis Abeba, that he studied especially. The subtitle is on how global actors and concepts influence urban transformation. And let me welcome also my collaborator in my team, Ferdinand Pappenheim, and also the I'm just realizing that we don't have your chair, but we need it. So a co-organizer of the lecture series. So thank you. Thank you very much for joining. So, okay, how to begin? I have several questions, but maybe one that is. Let me start with this. You hinted that these new practices of in which architects and urban planners will be able to join and divert these, let's say, mainstream processes of urban transformation, urban restructuring that we refer to as neoliberal. Those still need to be nurtured. No? So I'm curious to ask you, and I'm sure students are really curious to speak about them. How do they relate to democracy, to justice, to territory? What does this mean when we go in the opposite direction than privatization? How do we do it practically, right? How do we gather people? At what scales? How do we envision this new idea of the urban. And I'm curious also to discuss, if it's not too abstract, or let's try to unpack it. I mean, what is the role of the state in that process? How do you see it? Because you are a highly, let's say, qualified person to talk about it, having had your experience. I mean, first of all, being an architect, an urban planner, having worked in government institutions and eventually in the UN.
Thank you for the question. Wow. The second one will require another hour. Yeah. So let me stick on my own experience and the experience of urban social movements in Brazil. The urban reform movement, which was a movement where I was a part in the late 70s, together with informal settlements dwellers, favela dwellers, and architects and engineers and lawyers were pretty much involved with. And our strategy by that time, and it was a dictatorship in Brazil, and this was one of the components, one of the struggles to overcome, to defeat dictatorship, was this urban front. Our main target was the state. In terms of, at the same time, we were pressing for more democracy, free parties, free organization, and we are pressing for public policies that would recognize the existence of the poor and informal settlement dwellers and provide them with infrastructure, with schools, with health system, with urbanization, exposed urbanization, because the neighborhoods were there already, but at least being seen, being visible, and object of the state. So the whole strategy and the whole work was getting more strength and gaining positions within the state, first at local level, municipalities, and then state level, and then national level as well, in order to implement and enforce those policies, inscribing them in the legislation. And that happened. Policies were inscribed in the legislation, stronger positions from the left and the Workers' Party in the parliament happened. But then what happened? What happened is that during the same period, so I'm talking about 90s, late 80s and 90s, neoliberalism was also coming in Brazil in a parallel way. And they had a very perverse encounter between the two, which means that while we were looking for the state and public policy at the ground level, the change towards a much more neoliberal culture was taking place at all levels. And of course, it's complex to explain why that happened in Brazil in a way, but a program like My House, My Life, the housing program was launched under the Workers' Party rule and using the right to housing as its main justification, but it was a huge frontier for financialization. It provoked a price boom in the land prices and real estate prices in the cities. It aggravated housing conditions in the cities. So what I'm saying now, what I'm looking now, and what I'm saying now is that states throughout the last century and the second half of the last century became so identified with capital that I really, really don't believe in state capacity, in the way states are organized today to overcome and regulate. State had promoted financialization. So what do we have besides states? It's a huge question. It's a huge question. But I think that I am much more, and I see social movements in Brazil today, much more trying to experiment other forms of self-management, of creating space, of commony, and of course, asking for public money to fund, because without public money you cannot fund. But the problem is, the modernist idea is that the public money comes together with a specific formula and a specific form. The public money does not come to the freedom of citizens. So I see today much more pushing towards a decentralized and self-managed undertakings that can be multiple instead of one single way of addressing things through public policy. I don't know if it is.
Thank you for the very interesting and inspiring lecture, by the way, I think. I just want to go on with this discussion about the state, because I think that's very very important, and I would just locate it in one of my own expertise, so the case of Egypt, where you have, I mean, for one of the case study, I kind of like made a chronicle review of the way the state in its various forms, say from 1800 to today, has dealt with land tenure, right? So how ownership was once in the hands of an empire, and then distributed to royalty, then distributed to, let's say, colonial forces. And then at one point there was a break, and that's Nasser and the kind of, let's say, the Arab socialism moment, where the state reverted, or let's say stopped this commodification of land by redistributing it. So stripping big landowners from their assets by capping, with the policy, by capping the ownership amount to a certain number of hectares. You could not own as much as, and then distributing it to small landowners, for instance. And this went through, percolated throughout, up, like, let's say, up to now, except that at one point, of course, neoliberal forces came and played, the Mubarak era, etc., which they started to revert these processes by taking some, like, arguing that some of the transfer were illegal, and starting to transfer, abolishing the capping of the laws and the policies, but somehow it's not gone yet. Let's say that this moment of change in the commodification of land is still ongoing, and even though it's under attack, it's still there. So I'm just wondering if, when you say that you have lost hope in the state, is there not a possibility to imagine that there would be a time, or there could come a certain, let's say, someone is maybe like too naive, but let's say a kind of a reversion, or maybe a subversion of the state in its current form to take such radical steps as the step that Nasser took. So I'm just trying to see if there is not still some hope in the state, because for me, what you're talking about in this organization of the people, I feel like it can only do so much. I mean, I also saw it in other cases, in cases of infrastructure, in cases of, let's say, everything that requires a momentum or a critical mass of investment. People cannot provide that. The state has to do that. So would you not imagine that there could be nevertheless a way to maybe, let's say, hijack the state, not in that sense, but see a rising force of people that would then use the state again as a tool to make changes?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for bringing the issue of land. As I didn't have the time to develop that, but in the book, this urban warfare book, there is one part on financialization of housing, and then the second part is on land. And land reforms were and have been a fundamental tool to financialization. So, and tenure relations are key in order to understand all that. And all sorts of tenure relationships that are not private property or freehold were, during these decades, fragilized towards property. And a lot of countries passed new land reforms. There was a wave of land reforms towards this system of private property as the one. And so that leads me to something that I was preparing to lecture, but then I thought that it was better to talk about housing here. So I can do my second lecture now, which is the relationship between private property and the whole process that I'm talking about. And the relationship between private property, citizenship, and freedom and rights. So I'm talking about a very specific type of state that emerged as a utopian in the Enlightenment, which is the liberal state, with individual freedoms based on property and private property. So I see today a kind of the extreme of this utopia being lived, when finally almost all the countries are, almost all, based on the same model of liberal democratic state based on private property. And the state became the property owner of the public realm. So this is part of the same logic. So I think that what is in crisis today is this state, and this state which is pretty much based on private property. When the Berlin Wall fell and we had reforms everywhere in the different versions of communist states, was really the defeat of an idea of a state-run society and economy, and the triumph of a private market liberal society. That is the triumph. So the triumph is very dystopian. So what I see now is, I know that it's very abstract and very philosophical thing, but I think that the crisis that we are living is a deeper crisis, is a crisis of this specific model of relationship between men and territories, which started as a utopia 250, 300 years ago, and today became a dystopia. And then what's going to happen? Well, let's imagine. Let's see. Let's create. Let's experiment. I really don't know. I imagine those who were living during the Enlightenment, they probably were freaking out. Also, what's going to happen with our lives and the way that our lives are organized? So I think we are really living through this type of moment, and some of us didn't realize, and we think that, oh, life is normal. But I think it's more and more being like that, and we have to deepen our discussion on tenure and relationship between property, tenure, nature, the self.
All right. Also, from my side, thank you for your lecture. My question is, or maybe it's more a comment, is like it's really going right into this aspect that you just mentioned, because I think it would have been nice. I don't know who was here last semester for the first talk with Patrick Schumacher. This was the other side, and I thought that Patrick Schumacher, as an architect and really a strong proponent of, advocate of the neoliberal system, even though he was contradicting himself and everybody knew that not everything is really true what he's talking about, he had a kind of he swept us away. He was like here, he was talking very confidently, he had this whole story of this neoliberal project in his pocket, and which is basically based on what you just said, a very specific understanding of freedom, liberty, democratic thinking linked to property. And I found this kind of devastating and also kind of, when I reflected in a way that, you know, there was this whole story and narrative behind it that is very strong. It's very seductive. It's very strong. It comes like, you can, like you said, go back to the Enlightenment. You can go back to industrialization, to modernization, and I was struck that there's the kind of big narrative that could counter this is not as strong as it maybe was or was for a certain time in the post-war area or during the wars. So I was really struck by that there's no kind of maybe seductive is a little bit too strong, but a narrative that I think could be possible if you think about these aspects of property differently, the aspects of what democracy means differently, and bring it into a kind of a story and narrative that relates to people and could be as strong as this kind of neoliberal talk that a lot of people have and ride on the success of this, right? So I was wondering if, you know, how, you know, you're talking about these bottom-up initiatives, people organizing themselves, but is there a way how this could lead, or do you see in the case of Brazil maybe, that there's kind of a momentum that this becomes a more kind of a serious and alternative kind of framework that people really think, yeah, that's great, that's something I can subscribe to. That's something that gives me arguments against the other kind of things that we hear all day from the government or from the corporations.
Yeah, I love a phrase from Newsmith, the geographer, that Scottish geographer. He says, neoliberalism is dead but dominant. And I add a comment by Franco Berardi, an Italian philosopher, and he said, Franco Berardi, he says, and we are living in a corpse. That's why it's so annoying. And I completely agree. I completely agree with that. It is triumphant. It is dominant. Finally, it reached all the planet. Finally, it defeated all other utopias like state-led, macroeconomic, and things like that. But at the same time, dialectically, the forces that will defeat this type of thinking are there already. And one of the forces, I think, is environmental limits, because the idea that we could have an infinite possibility of producing goods, and we can buy more and more and more these Chinese artifacts, hundreds of them, every day, and everybody will have money to buy more and more and more. I mean, it's clear that it's not true. That the possibility of having this standard of living, for instance, of level of consumption that we have in Europe, is based on the fact that you have the others. The others, they are super, mega, hyper exploited and don't have this level of consumption. It's just impossible. It's impossible. So it's a very clear limit. Of course, you can say, okay, let's occupy Mars or the moon, and we expand the planet there. Yeah, it's there. It's been planned already. But of course, I think we are living in this, within these contradictions today. And I think that for another very clear limit of this failure, and I was clearly showing that in the housing sector. So what was the theory? The theory was that the market could provide adequate housing for all. Okay, that was the concept, the theory. Then the concept was enforced, implemented through housing policies everywhere. Okay, so let's do science here. What was the result? The result is housing crisis everywhere. So it's a failure. It's clearly, it failed. As simple as that. So what comes next? So there is a whole generation, especially the youth, that people like you that were born already under this triumphant ideology, saying, so this is not true. I won't get better housing, better consumption, more consumption. So what's going to happen now, I think, is more and more reaction to that, and more building and trying to build alternatives to that, which, by the way, we don't know exactly what, because, of course, state-led authoritarian regimes, we don't like them, we don't want them, we don't want neither this neoliberal, super-concentrated power. So where can we go in between? Having said that, it's important to say that is in this meanwhile, what can we do politically? We can support those political coalitions that open space and nurture those experiments while continuing doing business as usual. So that's why, having said everything that I said, I would say if a coalition led by the Workers' Party will be in the second turn of the elections in Brazil, I will vote, even if I have criticism, even if I know that there are limits on their policy, because at least their policy can bring some distribution of wealth, some better conditions of living for low-income people. So even if it's not my ideal, and I'm very critical of the policy, I still can work on that. But in this meanwhile, and this is very important, in replying your question in Brazil, I think a new social movement and a reorganization of social movement today is emerging, bringing together indigenous movement together with the landless movement and squatter movement in urban settings, together with very, very powerful struggles against racism, and especially by women and women's movement, which has been really, really raising and coming in Brazil with a lot of strength. So new forces are coming and are emerging, and who knows if they're going to get sufficient momentum and political momentum to reverse. Probably not now, probably, but maybe in 10 years from now. But what's the problem? We have plenty of time.
Just to say, hopefully we have plenty of time. I mean, you refer to the limits and to those famous limits to growth, the ecological limits, and they were giving us a bit less time. I'm not sure the Club of Rome had some pretty threatening predictions. So so let's see how much time we will really have. Indeed. Would you like?
So my question would go back to the topic of the form, or let's say the role of the architect. Mm-hmm. So obviously as a sort of moderator of these social processes, or as an advocate of this grassroots movement, the architect has to play a more important role. I think this is also something we discussed in previous lectures, but in her capacity as a designer of giving form, you said in this first slide that global capital sort of manifests in these shapes that we see, that is also a form that it can understand or that attracts it. Is there a form that can somehow capture it? Also this form, of course, represents something that is freely moving across the globe and can leave at any moment, so it's somehow just a substitute. Is there a form that we can look for, or that we can design for, that I don't know, subverts this logic of capital moving whenever it does not generate profit anymore?
Yeah, it's a very good question. It's easier to identify the forms that are related to financial capital than the ones that are emerging from other processes, because I talk much more as a process than as a product. So what we have on this of these forms that are repeated all over the planet, they are products. They're finished products. That's why they have a universal language, and they are finished products, and that's why they are legible for financial capital, and financial capital can go in and out easily those forms, so they are 100% subjected to the financial capital, pretending that they represent architectural imagination. This spider form building, or I don't know, butterfly form building, or golden, I don't know, things like that. But the other thing is much more a process than a product. A process in terms of, when we say common, we talk about commoning, we talk about building, we talk about nurturing, we talk about experimental, we talk about something that is a process of designing and living and designing at the same time. Where I can recognize that, because this is already there. Some of our students at the School of Architecture in São Paulo, they live in the squatters. And they transform everyday life of the squatter building using their architectural knowledge and sharing with that. This is a big difference I see in my generation when we started to build the urban reform platform. We were architects, students, and we related to the people in the informal settlements, but we didn't live there. We live in our own houses in the middle-class neighborhoods where we were raised. And now it's very different. And the amount of not only architects, engineers, and artists, and artwork, and cultural producers that are in situ, that are there, living and transforming, and the studio is the life and the house, and this is all mixed in the same experience, and this is very new for this generation, so I see this as the new process. And I don't know what's going to be the new product outcoming from this process, but I see that is an ongoing, also in planning, not only at the building specific place, but also this is happening also now in planning, and one of the experiences we are involved with in the School of Architecture of the University of São Paulo is in a neighborhood in downtown area that calls Cracolândia, Crackland, which is a drug addict spot, and we are formulating and creating a new plan for the area together with the people that live there, and at the same time resisting to the demolition and eviction and repression with bombs and violence that this place is living through. So it's more a process.
Because I think the answer basically of your question was the form, and you answered process, not form. But I think that we talked about it briefly yesterday, and I believe that you visited yourself a few of this morning. But I think maybe there is an interesting case to look at that is quite strong here, which is the cooperative model, which is also has a form and a process. It's tied together. To my knowledge, there is no skyscraper cooperative yet. But I just wonder if there is a form attached to the process, then that would be the cooperative, because I think the cooperative is an example of something that is not public, but not private either. So it's a kind of a compromise for the common good, but only the good of the ones who are in the cooperative. So it also has limits in terms of, let's say, democracy, or I mean, it has a limit. But I just think it's an interesting example of thinking beyond the kind of dichotomy of public-private, and also thinking around this logic of land and property and tenure, because, for instance, cooperatives have a very particular form of tenure. So I just think that it's an interesting and promising example. And I have the feeling, I also met a few people that came here to learn and copy and export the model. So I could imagine that this would be also something that would be an interesting, let's say, alternative.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is such an interesting discussion, and I can hardly stop myself from commenting on every. So I will just I will skip my comment on cooperatives. I have to, but I will ask a question that I'm sure Marc would ask if he was here, and here it comes because he asks it every single time we have a guest speaker. And here is the question: how do we scale this up? And so you said the crisis is actually philosophical, and it goes much deeper and maybe to the Enlightenment and before, and it has to do with the relationship of man and territory and the kind of utopia we have set up back then. That is the liberal utopia. And when we talk about these new movements and new strategies that need to be nurtured to, let's say, transcend this, let's say, welfare state and the liberal utopia as the kind of two sides of the same coin, perhaps, as you were put in a way presenting it, of course, which is true. A couple of let's say notions have circulated around, and one particularly powerful was presented in a MoMA in New York in an exhibition. It was called Tactical Urbanism. We should be tacticians. We should engage, with the local communities. We should, show resistance, etc., etc. And then I remember Neil Brenner, that I'm sure you know, and you also cite his work and so on. He's a very, very important geographer and also a scholar, a Lefebvrean scholar, so somebody very familiar with the right to the city movement. And he wrote a kind of a very powerful criticism of this exhibition and this notion of tactical urbanism, and said, look, we will not get very far, because we need strategies that can scale up, right? And he somehow pointed to, although it was in a way inconclusive, but to the kind of a how to in fact recapture and reform the state as a strategy that as a structure that is in a way organizing the territory, but also has the potential to democratize the territory, right? And I wanted to ask you, what are your insights on the idea of scale?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question that was raised also by Charlotte before, which is, we need subway networks. So how can you do self-managed subway networks or water systems? And so, of course, you need scale. And of course, you need something that can bring together, and the city, it's not an addition of small undertakings. And I'm also very critical about tactic urbanism and the way, as a matter of fact, has been a tool to gentrify a lot of neighborhoods and spaces in, for instance, in downtown São Paulo. But then I think our utopia, again, in the 80s and 90s, was participatory planning. So the idea was that we should have, the planning exercise should not be a conversation between real estate entrepreneurs, contractors, architects, engineers, and politicians, which is this, basically, is the conversation between architects, engineers, real estate entrepreneurs, politicians, and contractors of public works. So the idea is basically democratize planning and democratize the whole discussion of planning, the whole strategic discussion of how to build territories. And we beg a lot on disseminating this process. And my main task as the National Secretary for Urban Programs in Brazil during the PT Workers' Party in Lula's first term we create the Ministry of Cities, and one of the ideas behind the creation of Ministry of Cities was to push for a national campaign over the country to make every municipality undertake a participatory planning effort and open up the discussion on strategic decisions for the people. But then, what happened? Always happen things. And we created a national council with representatives from all kinds of sectors in order to push that together with the state. So it was also a civil society undertaking and campaign, and not only a state campaign. What happened? What kind of barrier we encounter? What in practice? Several. Of course, concentration of power at the local level, clearly. So in some municipalities, forget to open up the discussion with the people, never. So in some municipalities was like that. In other municipalities where civil society was organized, unions are organized, social movements were organized, that was pushed towards a much more public discussion on master plan, so strategic planning of the territory. But then, guess what was the barrier? Language, which is planning, what we call in Portuguese, planejez. Planejez, it is planning language. Planning language is not meant for public participation. Planning languages is meant for a conversation between real estate entrepreneurs, contractors, and politicians. So we didn't realize before leaving it, it was so difficult to undertake this participatory planning exercise at this level, at this strategic level. Of course, at the neighborhood level, or very local, yes, it's possible, it's related to daily life. But on this, so the main barrier was language and of planning and planning theory. So I badly think we should rethink the language of planning. And how to do that? Who knows? But let's try. But I thank you for bringing this, because let's not give up of the idea of having participatory planning, but real ones, not public hearings. That's what happened with us. Public hearings that some technical guy shows the plans and the numbers, and everybody's like that. Nobody understands anything, and then comes a guy, and it's a ritual of repeating things that nobody really interacts. So I think we should not give up of this idea of having a much more deeper understanding of participatory planning at the strategic level, but also we, planners and architects, we have the obligation of trying to find another language to do that. And I think it's absolutely possible. It's a question of posing the question in front of us.
Let's take just one question from the audience. I know it's deeply unfair, but we already.
This is not very democratic.
It's not. I'm really, because I just looked at the time and I thought, well, perhaps we can't.
Well, thank you very much. I feel a bit embarrassed to get this only opportunity to ask a question. But I wanted to ask, I would have many questions, but I'm afraid I have to limit myself to one. The new urban agenda and the sustainable development goals, especially SDG 11, have actually again re-emphasized the importance of housing. It seems that there is a commitment again to put housing at the center. Would you say that's just rhetorics and that the strategies to operationalize this commitment towards housing is through the neoliberal model only, or are there also around the world countries which really look towards this commitment or think about realizing this commitment through more participatory and bottom-up approaches?
Thank you for bringing that. In one phrase, new urban agenda, blah, blah, blah. Because, so then you can have another question.
Okay.
Blah, 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 which means basically, if you see what is written in the rhetoric, in the agenda, and then you see what international cooperation at the international level, World Bank policies, multilateral, bilateral donors are doing in real financialization of housing. And now, the same thing that I have seen, the dissemination of home ownership as the one and only model, now rental housing is the new trend. So you can see already coming everywhere. So again, I mean, this agenda does not lead any meaningful actor which is on the scene today towards this agenda. So besides of being a place for social movements and movements around the right to the city to meet and socialize, I really don't know what is the purpose and what's for this agenda. I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'll claim some space for this side of the room with many questions and maybe not so easy to answer. Let's see. First, a comment, and I think it might also relate to what Sasha was asking, the bigger question, the bigger addressing from claiming against neoliberal practice relates also to the question of scale. I was very intrigued reading recently about non-scalability theory, tracing back the idea of upscaling into plantation history as a neoliberal concept. So asking this question makes it already a kind of a tricky one. That's the comment, maybe. And then to come to the same author, Anna Tsing, I was very impressed by, or I was thinking that during your presentation that we see maybe the failure of social housing, or we see the destruction of social housing. And then I somehow was remembering the subtitle of her new book saying about the possibility of life in the ruins of capitalism. And I thought, is there a possibility? It's a form also relating to, but I think we see the kind of ruins of this kind of development, and we blame them. But I was wondering, is there a possibility in this as well? And somehow that was it showed me a different, or I thought, is that a different way of looking at it? And maybe you have examples in this kind of claiming. And the third one, maybe that's the most tricky, I'm not sure. I was thinking about the debate, thinking about what you described as kind of social movements, collaborative housing, which is a question of the scale as well. What does regionalism or regional idea opposed to the nation state mean in that context? I mean, does that just produce the nation state on another level, or is there a possibility on regionalism for development as well? Or does it just shift to not speak about a nation state but something else? So another hour maybe.
Now, this last question, I think it's so European. The question of regionalism. and it's not a debate, for instance, in Latin America, except for, it's not a debate at all, except for the indigenous question. Because one of the few movements that we have that have some small discourse of autonomous territories that can self-manage themselves and in a way be a little bit out of the nation state is part of the struggles of indigenous communities to survive. And some of them, like the Mapuche or some of other groups, are really pushing this agenda forward. And maybe maybe through this, this issue will come. But let me take your second question on, and I think you are absolutely right. And I was lecturing some days ago in Oslo, and one of the more or less around the same issue, and one of the people that were there, it's a geographer, North American geographer, Don Mitchell, which works on the cities that are completely out of this neoliberal reconstruction. So they were left out of the game, like Detroit, and some places, Ohio, and places that are completely destroyed. And I know that in Europe also you have some cities that are completely were industrial places, they are not anymore, and they didn't become a neoliberal hub for creative class or something like that. So it's just a ruin. And there is a lot of things coming out of these ruins because people just go there and survive. And so since we are talking about spatial fix, my question is there a counter cycle of spatial fix which is possible, taking over destroyed places and making them livable again for the people who are the leftovers of these undertakings of capital? And I think, and I think the answer is yes. But the problem is that today, without absorbing some public funds, is impossible. Having said that, it's very important to say that the idea that the state does not have money and then we need private capital to do things in scale is a complete lie, because it's massive public fund on these operations that is transferred massively to private hands in order to put money in these operations. That's what public-private partnerships are. So I think it's very legitimate to argue again that public funds, at least a part of it, should be transferred to other types of programs and undertakings. And I come with the final example from Minha Casa Minha Vida again, the program in Brazil. It was launched, 4 million houses were built in 7 years, 4 million in 7 years, with more than $100 billion as investment, and very important part of it, budget money from the state in order to subsidize, in order to make possible for low-income people to get into the housing. So it was heavily subsidized by the state. And then when the program was launched, we were in the Ministry of Cities 4 years before, trying to formulate, together with social movements, a national housing policy, which had nothing to do as a format and as a program with My House, My Life. So when My House, My Life was launched by the government, people that were involved in this other initiative, and especially housing social movements around housing, they would say, oh, what's going to happen now? So the negotiation between the state, the national state, and the movement was, okay, we're going to provide 1% of the money of My House, My Life, the budget money, to you, to self-managed cooperatives. 1% is 1 billion. It's a lot of money. 1 billion. It's a lot of money. So a lot of self-managed cooperatives could be done, and interesting projects could be done. You can say, oh, it's a minority? Yes, but still, it was something that was possible through these funds, a very small part of the public funds. And it's very interesting to see the real experiments because, and talking about form, part of the houses that were produced through this specific part, which call Minha Casa, Minha Vida, entidades, My House, My Life, entities, so it's the self-managed cooperatives, part of it, they look exactly the same as the market ones, the private market ones. Exactly the same. You cannot see the difference. But part of them, no. Part of them have innovative design things. They have collective things. They really try to have good architecture. And they succeed. And they succeed. So what I'm saying here, and there is a scale on that. When I'm talking about squatter movements in São Paulo, I'm talking about presently probably 200 buildings that are occupied in consolidated areas, plus if you take the peripheral organized squatter, we are talking about squatters with 4,000 families, 5,000 families. So for me, this is already scaled. We are not talking about one building with 2 families. We are talking about a very wide, city-wide, metropolitan-wide movement that can bring some novelty, I think, on that. So that's why it's so difficult to talk about scale, because it depends. What do you think? What do you mean about scale?
Let me say, this is, we've started this lecture series last semester, so this is the 8th lecture, number 8. And I feel now, finally, we are starting to get to the bottom of things. So I'm personally really grateful to you. I think this was really fantastic and really inspiring. And I hope also for the students, and we will work with those ideas and let's say pointers we got from you. So thank you so much, and please thank Raquel Rolnik.
Thank you. Thank you.